Welcome everyone. In this video, we are going to see about introduction to AWS Config. So what is AWS Config? AWS Config, it provides a detailed view of configuration of our AWS resources in our AWS account. So this includes how the resources are related to one another and how they are configured in the past so that we can easily see the configuration and the relationships changes over the time. And also an AWS resource is kind of an entity which will be working in AWS, such as an elastic compute cloud instance, an EBS volume, a security group, or an VPC. Now let's see what is the features of AWS config. The first one is the resource management. So in the resource, we can specify which type of resource type do we want AWS config to record. And also we can set up an Amazon S3 bucket to receive a configuration snapshot on the request and also for configuration history. And to send the notifications, right? So we can also set up Amazon SNS to send configuration stream notifications. And also to do these kind of settings, we need to grant AWS config the permission it needs to access the S3 bucket and SNS topic. And the next one is the rules and conformance pack. So here we will be giving some specific rules that we want AWS config to use to evaluate the compliance information for the recorded resource types. And also by using conformance pack or collection of AWS config rules and the remediation actions that can be deployed and monitored as a single entity in our AWS account. And the next one is the aggregators. And what is the use of an aggregator is like it will give a centralized view of our resource inventory and the compliance. So basically an aggregator is an AWS config resource type that collects AWS configuration and compliance data from multiple AWS account and AWS region into a single account and the region. And the next one is the advanced query. So with this, we can use any from AWS, they are giving some sample queries, or we can also write our own query by referring to the configuration schema of the AWS resources. Now we have seen what are all the features of AWS config. Now let's see how AWS config works. So first, when we turn on AWS config, it first discovers the supported AWS resources that exist in our account. And after that, it will generate a configuration item for each resource. It will have a generic configuration item. Once the AWS config generates the configuration item, when the configuration of a resource changes, and it maintains also an historical record of the configuration item of our resources from the time we start the configuration recorder. So by default, AWS config, it will create a configuration item for each supported resources in each region. So if we don't want AWS config to create a configuration item for all supported resources, we can also specify some. For example, I have almost 100 resources, but among that only 5 are seems to be production. Then we can enable 5 specific resources, kind of maybe EC2, S3, VPC, and CloudFormation, and the other services which we want. So we can also configure specific resource type as well. And also AWS config keep track of all changes to our resources by invoking a describe or the list API call for each resource in our account. So basically it will invoke a describe or list API to get all the changes for the resources. So the services uses those same API calls to capture configuration details for all the related resources. For example, let me give an example so that you'll get a better understanding. So I am going to remove an egress rule from an VPC security group. So what this AWS config will do, it will invoke a describe API call on the security group AWS config then invokes a describe API call on all of the instances associated with the security group. The updated configurations of the security group, right? And the each instance are recorded as a configuration items and delivered in a configuration stream to one Amazon S3 bucket. Here you can see it, right? Amazon S3 bucket, the configuration information will be going to Amazon S3. And also it also tracks the configuration changes that were not initiated by the API as well. So at that time, what it will do, it will examine the resource configuration periodically and generates configuration items for the configuration that have been changed. So here we will be getting a new term called AWS Config Rules. So if we are going to use AWS Config Rules, AWS Config continuously it will be evaluating our AWS resource configuration for a desired settings. So depending on the rule, AWS Config will evaluate our resources either in response to configuration changes or periodically. So each rule will be associated with the AWS Lambda function, which contains the evaluation logic for the rule. So when AWS config evaluates our resources, it invokes the rule AWS Lambda function. So the function returns the compliance status of the evaluated resources. If a resource violates the condition of a rule, AWS config will automatically flag the resource, and the rule will be the rule as a non-compliant. When the compliance status of a resources changes, AWS config will also send a notification to your Amazon SNS topic as well. Here you can see other APIs, SNS, CloudWatch, and S3. So these things are the deliver changes history, and then it will snapshot the file to our S3 bucket for analysis. Now we have seen how AWS config works.